evened out. Okay, so welcome to CONES, our monthly California Naturalist online event series. My name is Alex. I use pronouns she, her, and I'm the community practice educator for UC Environmental Stewards. This series was created for UC California Naturalists and Climate Stewards to connect across the state on topics including natural history, ecology, climate change, and the intersection of pressing human and environmental issues. If you would like to see our past CONES events, we'll be adding a link to the chat. I do have one more past CONES event that I still have to upload. But this one, because it's so important, because it's our new book, I'm actually going to work on uploading by tomorrow. So you can expect, if you know of anyone who missed this, you can share the link to our CONES archives tomorrow. So we are expecting a full house today. So just a few bits of housekeeping to go over. This is a Zoom meeting, not a webinar. So please remember to mute your mic and turn off your video during the presentation portion so we don't have to worry about background distractions. If you're having technical issues, please type them in the chat and we'll work with you to troubleshoot. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. Please add question to the chat with question as the first word so that we can easily find them at the end. And like I said, we are recording this presentation and it will be available online tomorrow. Before we begin, I'd like to start off by acknowledging that this virtual presentation is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, home to nearly 200 tribal nations. I'm speaking to you from Nisenan land in what's now Nevada City. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. We encourage you to learn which tribal nations are indigenous to the area where you are now living. We'll add a link to the chat where you can find more information. And I do have a couple of really exciting announcements. So tomorrow is the last day to register for our 2025 regional rendezvous happening next week in Arcata, California. So you will get to see a number of the people who are giving, so all the authors will be there and most of the UC Environmental Stewards team will be there. So if you're already registered, congrats, we'll see you next week. And if you haven't registered yet, you only have one day left to do so. And I do also want to share a save the date. We're super excited to announce that our 2026 statewide conference is now scheduled and on the books. We're working on getting a website up where you can learn more information, but it's being planned for next October 9th through 11th, and it's going to be in Santa Barbara on the UCSB campus. And so we're super excited to join with our whole statewide community for that event. And so now I'm going to turn it over to the UC Environmental Stewards Director, Greg Ira, who's going to introduce our presenters today.
Thanks, Allie. I'm really pleased to be able to kick off this CONES webinar and briefly introduce, or in some cases reintroduce, our guests, the three authors of the much anticipated second edition of the California Naturalist Handbook. I'll start with Greg DeNevers. He's an accomplished botanist, ecologist, and naturalist with extensive experience across California and in the New World tropics. His passion for botany began early as he grew up around Mount Tam, and he's been working for institutions like the California Academy of Sciences, the Missouri Botanical Garden, to name a few. Among other things, he brought his knowledge of California's plant and animal communities and talent for storytelling to the book, both the first and the second edition. Greg is a botanist currently furloughed with the U.S. Forest Service in Happy Camp in Siskiyou County. Deborah Stanger Edelman is a co-founder of the California Naturalist Program and has dedicated over 30 years to natural resource restoration, conservation, and education. She's helped develop programs for community groups, businesses, and state agencies and nonprofits like the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. Deborah brought her experience, her attention to detail, and passion for environmental policy and advocacy to the second edition of the handbook. And Adina Merenlender is an internationally recognized conservation biologist, a professor of cooperative extension at UC Berkeley, and is the founding director of the UC California Naturalist Program that continues today in large part because of her leadership then and her ongoing support today. With over 110 scientific research articles to her name, she specializes in the forces that influence biodiversity loss. She also co-authored the Climate Stewardship book, which is a core component of our Climate Stewards course. Adina brought her conservation expertise, her ability to see the big picture, and rigorous academic and scientific foundation to the production of the second edition of the handbook. So please join me now by using the emoji reaction, whatever they call those things, on your Zoom menu box, and welcoming these three guests that are so essential to our program. So before we start, most of you know that the handbook is required reading for your California Naturalist certification, but it is much, much more than a course requirement. The book is an introduction and an invitation to enjoying, discovering, and stewarding California's unique environment. As I reread the book, for me, it was like walking down a familiar trail, but walking in the opposite direction. There are things you didn't notice the first time you walked by and things that are new. And that kind of encapsulates this second edition for me. They're going to tell us more about those things, but before we jump into it, I wanted to thank them all for their support they've given to our program and pose one quick question myself. Today, the UC Environmental Stewards program has 76 local partner organizations supporting both California Naturalist and Climate Stewards. It trains 1,600 participants a year who contribute over 60,000 hours of stewardship service a year. And Adina will recognize how this collective impact network has changed over time. My question is this: in the second edition, you acknowledge that California's environment has changed. Our understanding of the environment has changed. Our society has changed. And I've just shared some changes in our program. On a more personal note, I'm curious how changes in your own lives during the last dozen or so years may have influenced how you approached the second edition. And I'll leave it to any of you to jump in and respond to that before you jump into your presentation.
So I'm already unmuted, so I'll start. Thanks, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone. Really nice to be with you, at least virtually. One of the big changes in my life, the biggest change in my life since writing the first edition, is I accepted a job with the U.S. Forest Service. And when we wrote the first edition, I was essentially an urban naturalist. My training was urban, my concerns were urban, my experience was urban. And for the last 5 years, I've lived in a really remote place and dealt with issues of land management on a 1.5 million acre national forest. And so my perspective has changed a lot because of that.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg. Deborah or Adina?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I'll riff on that because during the last 12 years, I also took a new job and I was working as the water program manager for the Mendocino County Resource Conservation District and got a really deep dive into groundwater sustainability and into forecast-informed reservoir operations and all kinds of things that are applicable all across the state, but were really, intense drought where our Lake Mendocino went completely dry. That definitely influenced how I approached my part of the second edition. And then also just seeing how things have changed politically, feeling really the need to stay really politically involved and keep working on things that are important. That's
Thanks,
all.
Deborah.
I'll just mention, hi, everyone. I'm calling in from Pomo land, Central Pomo country. And I guess I'll focus a little bit on that. It's been such a gift to co-design with Sage Lapina the Tribal Naturalist course through California Naturalist, and meeting with those participants, Indigenous Californians, and also building relationship with Don Hankins, who's a professor at Chico State, who's Central Valley Miwok, and trying to uplift Indigenous stewardship and all these other parts of my life. I think that really changed my thinking about how we might deal with that topic in the new book. And I'll also say, struggling through the climate stewardship book, working with Sarah May and everyone on climate stewardship and all of the people who helped in this room to develop that program really opened my eyes to more whole person thinking. And I think that helped me with this new edition as well. So back to Greg.
Right. Well, thank you for taking the time again to share a little bit about your background in that intervening period. We're going to jump right into the presentation that you prepared for us today. So I'll turn it over to Ali to start the share.
Can everyone see that well? Great.
Okay, shall I go ahead and kick it off? Okay, so again, thank you so much for coming today. It's really exciting to be able to share the second edition of the California Naturalist Handbook. And there's many things that are the same about the handbook as the first edition. It's still great for budding naturalists, newcomers to California, nature centers, and of course, participants in the classes. If you haven't already bought yours, you can order now from UC Press. We have the slide has the code that you can use to save 30%. Next slide. So our goals on the second edition mirror the ones for the first edition, a fun, science-based introduction to California's natural history with an emphasis on observation, discovery, communication, and stewardship. I'm assuming most everyone on this webinar, is familiar with the first book, but just in case there's a few people who were climate stewards and haven't taken the California Naturalist class, I'll just say a few of the goals. The handbook is to introduce readers to California's diverse ecosystems and species. A strong emphasis on empowering people to observe, record, and share what they discover. Provide improved content with the second edition, which we'll talk about in this presentation, for the certification course. Encourage hands-on restoration, monitoring, and climate action, and to build a statewide culture of environmental stewardship, which all of you who are here are part of. So next slide. Okay, so why a second edition? The second edition was really about two things, a changing state in multiple ways and a renewed vision for the program. So when we did the first edition, when it was first published, the program was in its infancy. The pilot program that had taken place at Santa Rosa Junior College used a reader. By the time the book was published, we had 1 or 2 classes. It was very new. This time we had the opportunity to take advantage of this wonderful community that has developed of instructors and of participants and certified naturalists. So we wanted to fill the holes from the first edition and gather the wisdom of the instructors. So we wanted to learn what worked, what didn't, what was missing. We wanted to reflect the updated science to reflect a changing world. I mean, a lot changed in those 12 years. We had devastating wildfires in multiple parts of the state, years-long droughts. People were really feeling the impacts. They're on a very personal level, people who had lost their homes, people whose wells had gone dry, in a way that was different than the first time round. And then we wanted to reflect more voices and approaches to stewardship than we did the first time. Tribal practices and contributions to stewardship, nature-based solutions, which are increasingly becoming part of state law and practice, and community advocacy. So there were multiple reasons that we wanted that there were needs. It wasn't just a matter of like, well, it's been 12 years. Let's put out a new book. There were real needs that needed to be addressed. So the revision process took a while, took nearly 2 years, and about 40% of the book went through some kind of revision, rewriting, updating, or had new material. all three authors reviewed the entire book exhaustively for everything, from the glossary to the illustrations, everything. And Greg and Karen helped us survey all the instructors with a questionnaire, which was followed by a meeting to really hear what people who were using the book on a daily basis saw as holes or issues that needed to be addressed. After we wrote our first revisions, we had colleagues and other experts review the updates, and then the manuscript was completely re-edited, re-indexed. We have a new glossary. Much is the same, but much is different. So next slide. Okay, so what's new? So updated overview reflecting new climate information about California's unique ecosystems with a much deeper dive into Southern California urban and desert ecologies. That was really a hole from the first edition that we just did not emphasize Southern California enough. Expanded discussions of Indigenous knowledge and stewardship, which was underutilized in the first edition, and Adina's going to talk a little bit more about that, as well as contributions by diverse naturalist leaders, reflecting urban as well as rural naturalists. Again, current climate information, updates on fire and forest management, drought, groundwater, new laws that have been implemented on some of these topics since the first edition, and a recognition of climate grief, because as I was saying, and as you all know, this is something that's becoming very, very immediate and personal. And I really have to give a shout out to Greg DeNevers for encouraging us in that direction. And I think it's a really important part of the book. And then new and better graphics, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Next slide. Oh, and now I'm going to hand it over to Greg to talk about the content.
So welcome to the storytelling portion of this presentation. So here we are looking at this book, this new book, which purports to be about how to be a naturalist. And here's this class that UC has put so much effort into to train people to be something called a naturalist. And it just strikes me that some of you may have asked the question, what the heck is a naturalist? And so everyone gets their own opinion about that. And I, of course, have mine. And I guess the first thing that I will say is, if you are interested in the world, you are already a naturalist. And if you like to explore, you are already a naturalist. So according to the dogma, you have to have a stamp on your forehead that says, I took the UC Naturalist course to be a naturalist. But really, in the deeper sense, if you're interested in the world and you're out there looking and listening and attending to the world, you are a naturalist. One of the really important aspects of being a naturalist is that naturalists look and listen deeply. And often this is correlated with or augmented by being quiet, being silent, and sitting still. So we have a really frenetic society. We move, we need entertainment, we keep going all the time. And one of the real skills of being a naturalist is to sit still, to stand still, to just be in one place and see how the world moves around you while you're being quiet. And I'll contrast that with things that I think maybe aren't that important to being a naturalist. Things like collecting, things like listing, things like owning. Those aren't really, to me, the most important aspects of being a naturalist. Anyway, the picture you're looking at is a California dogwood. And I suspect that many of you have seen the flowers of this tree. It's pretty common in Northern California. And I first saw this tree when I was about 21. And I was struck with it. They're beautiful flowers. And if you go to the next slide, what you'll see is what the tree looks like right now. And what it looks like is it's starting to lose its leaves. But the thing that I never knew and that I never realized, I never observed until I lived around this tree, is that unlike most trees, the dogwood doesn't turn all of its leaves color at the same time. It turns a few one day, and then they drop. And then the next day it turns a few more leaves color, and then they drop. And it's just a really different process. And to me, the important point of this is, if I hadn't lived around this plant and seen it day after day and week after week and month after month, I never would have had this observation. Next slide. So here's a picture of my friend John Schubert. He casts a long shadow. And John and I have known each other since college, and he lives in Bend, Oregon. And probably 30 years ago, my wife and I went on a backpacking trip in a place called the Three Sisters, which is a mountain range just west of Bend. And we're up there, and I ran across these really amazing rocks, just some of the coolest rocks I've ever seen in my life. They were really distinctive. And so I picked up a little tiny piece of this rock, and I brought it with me when we walked out of there. And when I saw John, I gave him this rock. And I said, "Hey, have you ever seen this before?" He said, "No." I said, "Oh, well, let me know when you find it." And 10 years later, John calls me and says, "Greg, you remember that rock you gave me?" And he had found it. He had been up on the North Sister and came across the same rock outcrop that I had come across. And I just thought that was really cool. Next slide. So this is a leaf of a bramble, a blackberry, and it's covered with some orange stuff. And the orange stuff happens to be a mushroom, a rust fungus. And this is something that I have seen since I was 21. It's really common. You see it on brambles. You see it on almost any member of the rose family. You see it on serviceberry. You see it on pears. You see it on all kinds of stuff. And again, here's something that I lived around. Here's something that I looked at and casually discounted. But, you know, it was part of my life for 20, 30 years, something like that. And if you go to the next slide, this is a picture I took in April of 2024. And all that jelly that looks like somebody took some jar of jelly and spread it all over the leaves of the incense cedar was something I found out on a walk. And of course, I looked at that stuff and said, "Wow, now isn't that cool?" And of course, I didn't know anything about it. So I called a friend of mine who is deeply involved in mushrooms. And I sent him this picture and I said, "What in the heck is that?" And he said, "Oh, that's gymnosporangium." And the cool thing about gymnosporangium is that it has a bimodal lifestyle. If you go back to the previous slide, it lives on brambles for 3 years. And during those 3 years, it throws spores into the air and they traipse around and land here and land there. And you go to the next slide. After 3 years, some of the spores that germinated on the incense cedar turn into this very different looking thing. It's the same organism, one species, with two really different looking kinds of life. If you go to the next slide. Anyway, I would, of course, be remiss if I did not leave you with a question. So this is a picture that I took a couple days ago. It's an alder tree. You're looking at an alder tree. And this tree is busy losing all its leaves. And you look at it and you say, "Wait a minute, those leaves are green. All the maples have turned yellow and all the dogwoods have turned pink and all the oaks have turned orange and everybody's leaves turn colors before they fall, right? Deciduous trees." Turns out alders don't. The alder leaves fall off green as they were born. And the question for you guys is, why is that? Adina or Deborah, I think it's on to you.
Great. And please put answers in the chat. Love that. Okay, everyone now knows why Greg DeNevers was the very first person that I contacted when we knew we had to write a book about natural history in California. He's a truly gifted naturalist and also interpreter. I've known Greg a long time, since way back when he worked and lived at Pepperwood Preserve in Sonoma County. And just want to thank Greg and Deborah for hanging in there for version 1 and now version 2. You can imagine my glee when I reached out to them and said, could we do it again? And they both were like, let's do it. I was like, wow, most people would go running away. So thank you so much. Okay, picking up on where I left off a little bit about building relationship with tribal members and tribal community members. I worked with help, particularly from Don Hankins and others, but to try to weave throughout the book examples of Indigenous-led stewardship and traditional ecological knowledge, and really bring in the emphasis on reciprocity, because it's so in line with what all of you do and what the Environmental Stewards program is advancing and caring for the land that sustains us. And in the new book, you're gonna be able to read/listen to a song, hear story from Indigenous storytellers. So we've really tried to weave these experiences in that we hope will touch your whole person. Next slide. One of the things we also wanted to share is the diversity of communities, Native communities in what we now call California. We worked on this map to show today's communities, not to put boundaries on them as a way of sort of, you know, who holds what lands, but more to share where folks exist now and how they're connected and connected to place. So that this is a new map that we put together, again, just so people could heighten their awareness to the number of current groups that are actively on the land. Next slide. Of course, we also want to acknowledge and share a bit about the historical impacts of colonization, and we do that in a way that I hope covers the topic well, but also, of course, this book tries to do everything. So we do nothing in full justice. We don't give anything full justice, but it's in there now. I think better than it was before. I think we show, not tell, the many ways of knowing that come from Indigenous communities, including some traditional ecological knowledge that we share, which is, of course, rooted in millennia of land stewardship and deep observation of nature. We also talk about how these other ways of knowing are passed on, intergenerational. And I think that's a super important direction that people are trying to work on, as well, as to provide more support so that that intergenerational knowledge transfer can continue within Indigenous communities in California. And I already talked about respect, reciprocity, and responsibility as really rooting the practice of being a naturalist, as well as we cover things like good fire and cultural burning, bulb distribution, coppicing, and other kinds of Indigenous stewardship practices. So next slide, please. And with a big emphasis, and this is a shout out and thank you to the Hopland Band of Pomo Indians, who I get the privilege of working right next to their lands here in Mendocino County. And the tribal historic preservation officer, Ramon Billy, had this great photo of people dancing now. So again, an emphasis not on thinking about things as the past, but thinking about what's happening now in tribal communities. Next slide. And this is in the book. This other picture, thank you to Allie Meters Knight, who's a tribal California naturalist graduate. And this is in the Chico area, Chico Creek area, where she works and her homelands. And this is a fairly typical scene of a cultural burning practice. It's a smaller scale type of activity. Notice nobody in the foreground is really wearing their nomex or anything. Everybody's just out in their clothes, tending the land. Next slide, please. And I mentioned also that the work that we did on the climate stewardship program influenced the book as well, especially, of course, on the climate change section. This is a moving target, right? I mean, we're going to share the science of today, and in 5 years, we're going to wish we could share again the science of the future. But we did what we could to update on topics such as fire, and as Deborah mentioned, drought, flooding, and Deborah's going to talk a little bit about groundwater, as water and climate are so inextricably linked. And we also mentioned already that building on trauma-informed and aware kinds of practices around climate grief and cultivating hope and actions. And for those who are climate stewards out there or have read the Climate Stewardship book, this is, of course, a nice painting by Obi Kaufman. Next slide. So just to give you an idea, a lot of work went into like digging into the recent model projections and then graphically explaining them in a way that we hope gets to the bottom line. Part of our role in extension is sometimes we have to dig up a lot of raw scientific facts and then figure out how do we share these facts in a way that can be digested more easily by the reader. And so we worked on these projections so people could see quickly, we still have time to get to low emissions. Let's work on it together. But what we're looking at if we just put our heads in the sand and keep going with fossil fuel burning and methane and other problems. So anyway, I think this graph for me, it almost, if you looked, I really should show you paired with the raw data, with a million lines in the middle, lots of model names and numbers. And once we take that and just try to simplify it a bit and hopefully present a graphic that is easy to digest. I also want to mention, even just working on the colors that were chosen for this graphic took some time, and Deborah worked hard on that. When you look at something in the book, I hope people will recognize that there are many iterations to get to the final version. Next slide, please. And then this focus that climate stewards know well on collective climate action. And so I'm wondering, what was interesting to me was I like to sometimes let the information bubble up into an emergent property and so what I did was I took a lot of the information that we shared in the Climate Stewards book, all the kinds of actions. I went through the whole book and where are all the actions? And then I came up with this, let those actions speak, and came up with this typology that there are actions that fell under civic engagement. Land stewardship, food, agriculture, and waste seem like good ways to cluster them. And I know Greg Iwer will appreciate this process. And I'm wondering if you all could take a minute, and for those who are at your keyboard, and just help us by putting in some actions that maybe you've been engaged with in the last couple of months. I'm going to rattle on some, but I think that probably in this room, here in this Zoom room, there will be actions in all of these types: civic engagement, land stewardship, and food. So if you have done some invasive species removal or been to a county meeting or shared with your family about climate change, please, I'm waiting. I'm looking at the chat and I'm going to stay quiet and I want to see those actions. Maybe you got together with friends and did them. Jump in. Great. Bye-bye stinkwort. Love that. Good. And I mentioned food and food waste, and I bet some of you are working hard on that as well, or maybe somebody did some gleaning and sharing. I know that was something I was involved with this harvest season. Wonderful. All right, keep them coming. Next slide, please. Oops, one back, and I'm going to pass it on to Deborah. on a very climate-related topic and topic of water, which is close to her heart. And she did an amazing job of updating the water chapter. Thank you, Deborah.
Thanks, Adina. So yes, water is obviously tied intimately to climate change, and definitely one of those areas where people feel those changes on an immediate and day-to-day level, whether it's drought or flooding. This is an example of a graphic that we added that integrates a lot of different things. It's about urban water issues, stormwater runoff, stormwater pollution, as well as infiltration and groundwater recharge. So this is a distinction between a natural ground cover, which readily takes up any rain that falls, versus an impervious surface, which is typical of most cities where there's a lot of runoff and it's very fast. So that doesn't allow infiltration. It doesn't allow deep infiltration into the groundwater. So this is an example of something that we added that really addresses a lot of different issues that we wanted to make sure that we touched on. In the water chapter, we also spent, as Adina mentioned, added a lot about the new groundwater, not so new anymore, groundwater sustainability programs that are happening throughout the state and the interaction between groundwater and surface water. And finally, we really did a much deeper dive into water equity and policy and how water is managed around the state and how that affects people on an individual basis, how one person can have access to water and somebody else doesn't, and why. So we did spend some time on that, really going beyond just like, what are the ecosystem impacts, which of course we discussed, but also the societal impacts. Next slide. And another new feature, which is really lovely, is that the illustrations were really improved this time round. For one thing, UC Press prioritized our having all color illustrations, which is amazing. And it was really sweet because one of the reasons that they did that is that part of their team had taken the California Naturalist class. So it was a great, full circle thing. But we were able to crowdsource new illustrations. We could ask instructors and class participants, certified naturalists, send us your pictures and use those. We just had a much broader range of photos to choose from. So there's much better imagery. It shows a more diversity of people and places. And they're designed to, like the whole course, invite curiosity and accessibility. And just as an example, on the next slide, of one of we got this wonderful photo of a pallid bat catching a longhorn grasshopper. We got that from someone who was essentially a professional photographer who was willing to let us use it in the book in exchange for an agreement, which of course we were readily happy to agree to, that we accurately discussed bats, and that was obviously part of our mission. But that's an example of an illustration, a photo that we didn't have in the first book, but we were really able to get access to outstanding new graphics. So that, I think, really adds to this edition. Next slide. So that pretty much wraps it up. We want to hear all your questions, but we want to make some thank yous. This was 100% a team effort. There are so many people who helped us, so many people to thank. Obviously, starting with Greg Ira and Karen Utsumi for just amazing support and assistance throughout. All the certified naturalists and instructors who gave feedback and provided photos. All the reviewers. Just shout out to Don Hankins, Rebecca Sarah Hernandez and Michelle Peters, Pamela Burns, Sarah Mae Nelson, Jill Santos, Elliot Frutel, and Alexandra Stefancic. And then shout out to the people at UC Press who were just great: Naya Pulliam Collins, Sylvia Bauer, Francisco Reinking, and Teresa Iafola. and Teresa Scher for indexing. But that's really, there were so many more, and thank you to everyone. If you are here and we didn't thank you, just know that we are thanking you. This was really a group effort. So that's all that we have, and we'd love to hear your questions or thoughts.
Before
right.
we jump into questions, I'm actually going to just launch a quick poll. And so this is just a quick 4-question poll, and this is just the same poll we ask every Cones presentation. And it's just a series of 4 questions, and you rate them on strongly disagree to strongly agree. They're not all applicable to every Cones, but we just use them in all of our Cones. So you should have seen the poll pop up, and you can just answer those. As that is going, we'll let Greg think over the first question. And I saw some questions come up in the chat, so we'll work on those. And yeah, feel free to pop your questions in the chat, and we'll ask them to the authors in just a moment when we get a large chunk of our participants doing the poll.
While you're managing the poll and looking for questions in the chat, I've just a quick question for the authors. The map of Indigenous people in California, the absence of boundaries, is that something you've seen somewhere else, or is that something that you all came up with or were given guidance on?
Yeah, there was a group of UC researchers down in Riverside and Irvine, and there's a SoCal group, and I'm sorry I'm not remembering their names to give them a proper acknowledgement. But they had written a paper or report about this and saying that they decided to not put these boundaries on. And we took a cue from them and then talked to them about their map. And then they were like, we don't really have a readily made one. Like, they did a small area to show and demonstrate their point. So they didn't do it for all of California. They did it for part of the area that they were working in down south. And then we really liked the idea. And so we worked with our IGIS team, UC A&R, Robert, Shane Fire, other wonderful people that are colleagues within A&R and Andy Lyons, who actually is like a very amazing resource on this particular subject. So he really helped us to do the best we could for the whole state as compared to that small area that the other researchers had worked on.
Okay, thank you. And if you want to come off mute and you have a question you'd like to pose to the authors, you can do that too, or drop it in the chat. I've seen a couple questions in the chat. Some are unrelated or kind of tangentially related that I think we can answer directly in the chat. Allie, did you have anything?
Yeah, so there was one question about the discount. So you have to start the process of ordering the book to have the place to enter the discount code. So what you do, I just put instructions in the chat. So you click the buy button on the UC Press, and then you select UC Press from the drop-down menu, and then follow the prompts for checkout. And then there will be a discount code box in the right-hand side, and you click apply. There was some questions about the Indigenous groups. There's one about there might not be not all Indigenous groups were mentioned, like the Rumsen, Ohlone, and the Monterey Peninsula area. And there's another question related to Indigenous groups, and it was related to how you chose which tribes' names, which versions of the names you used.
Yeah, I probably should have put the credit on that slide. And we do credit it very clearly in the book. And these are, this is an evolving process, right? Names matter, places matter, and there's no definitive source. When working on a book like this, we tend to prefer information that we can reference so that people can do that deeper dive in whatever we're working on. If we're choosing a graphic like from the IPCC, we know that people could go back and get that content. So likewise, Andy Lyons took that approach, and we used the digital atlas of California Native Americans provided by the California Native American Heritage Commission. Again, no source is perfect, but at least that way you can get all the metadata of how they developed those names, that list. But it is an evolving process, and I acknowledge that there's no perfect outcome. This information, as well as a lot of other information that sometimes just is moving quickly.
Awesome. This one's kind of a fun question. Was there any old material that felt good to remove that you were like, you know what? I'm happy that we updated this because I've been looking at this and it's been bothering me.
I'll try to address that, at least for me. There was nothing that I was like, ugh, you know, like that. But there were things that I was just like, you know, this should really be rewritten. It wasn't that the content was wrong. It was more like the approach, the tone. I felt there were several places where it's like, this could be better, not just better written, but the point of what we're saying could be made better, or it was just especially when it came to, in my opinion, when it came to contributions of Native American tribes or underrepresented groups, I felt like there were certain things like, we should really rewrite this. So that's my answer. I don't know about the other two.
Animals come to mind. Thanks, and shout out to Jen Riddell, who's an instructor up in Mendocino County, for really coming into my office and going like, part of the animal chapter is way too deep of a dive into some certain obscure physiology. And, you know, and it's really helpful because we love it all. And we love the obscure physiology too. But what she was pointing out was that for her readership, it was just a big distraction from the other things that were more relevant. So I feel like in the animal chapter, we kind of really took some of the details away, and hopefully by, it's like diamonds in the rough, you know, by trying to cut the rough out, hopefully the gems shine stronger in the animal chapter than they did before. Greg.
Yeah, and really, I'll just reiterate what everyone's been saying, that one of the real strengths of the second edition, I think, is all the crowdsourcing that we did. I mean, getting all the feedback from all the instructors and all of the participants and people that have become California naturalists. We got so much great feedback, and you know, it was partly telling us what worked and what didn't work, and here's this little minutia that, you know, needs to be changed. But the feedback was central to fixing that book into a better product.
Awesome. Awesome. So there's a couple questions about fire, and I'm going to present them both together. So one, is there a discussion of wildfire versus urban structural fires? It's important to identify that wildfires of Northern California are different than the Altadena fires of Los Angeles. And then the second is on cultural burns and the hope that cultural burns are included, since this is so important for California's well-being, because we have seen without cultural burns what happens.
Greg, do you want to take the fire questions?
Sure. There is discussion about fire. There is discussion about burning, and I don't think we particularly go into the difference between wildland fires and urban fires, but we do talk a lot about the wild and urban interface and the kind of problems that are related to that. And I will just say that I disagree with whoever says that the Altadena fire was different than Northern California fires, because I happened to live in Santa Rosa for many years, and we watched the town of Santa Rosa burn up just like the Altadena fire. So the town of Paradise, there's been a bunch of Northern California fires that did in towns just like the Altadena fire.
Awesome. There was a question that came earlier. Oh, yeah, Lauren, you had asked one of the questions, so I'll let you hop in real quick to offer any clarifiers.
Hi, thanks. I appreciate it. And I apologize for interrupting. Also, Deborah, we share a last name. I thought that was amazing. And so I would like to talk to you later. We might be related because it's like,
I
oh
was
my
wondering
God.
about that.
One of the writers of the book I'm related to, one of my friends is like, really? I'm like, just let me have this moment, Cameron. So basically, I am American Indian, and I have good friends who are California Indian. So I am a guest on their homelands, and some of them do cultural burns. I haven't made my way up to North Fork to join some of the cultural burns because sometimes that's where it is. You'll see a lot of people that are Ohlone, that are also taking part of it, and that's why I was curious about it because I know, like in Humboldt, they do a lot of that with the Kurok and the Hoopa. And I know that maybe this isn't necessarily like this book isn't only about California Indians, but California Indians are California. And that's why I asked about the fire. And I do agree with what Greg says, like the fire that you experienced has similarities with the other fire. And while I've experienced neither fire, I know that terrain is different, but they're still devastating. You know, like if you're surrounded by more forest, it's actually more dangerous, in my opinion, because my dad was a firefighter, and I my sympathy and compassion to anybody who's experienced that. I hope it's all right that I say that because I couldn't find my family earlier this year in the fire down south, and it was really scary. And I apologize for being personal, but fire, I've had family fight fire, and I've lost family to fire, and I wanted to say I hope that you're okay, and I hope that's all right. I've said that. Sorry, TMI.
No, you're good. That's the whole thing. It is our whole person that's involved in these topics, and we have a lot to listen from all of you, so I won't take too much time. I really am grateful to Allie Meters Knight for the story and photo that we included in her cultural burn that she led with her community, and Don Hankins, who's a leader in this space. And yes, it's so very important. I also want to mention the SoCal issue. I did look in the text to verify that, you know, we talk about the difference in fire regime and how often natural communities burned before we inhabited the lands and the density that we are now. And we talk about that frequency being less in the chaparral, in particular in Southern California, because I know that's hard on Southern Californians when we talk about how much fire is needed. These different ecosystems need different amounts of fire, and Southern California often is getting too much fire due to human-caused ignition.
Awesome. Melissa, I see that your hand's up, and I'm just going to have you wait one more second. There's a question earlier in the chat, and it's kind of a random one, but I just wanted to address it before we got to newer questions. And I don't think any of you are oak experts, but I could be wrong. But there was a question in the chat about how common it is to have 2 oak mast years in a row, because that is what the person Paige is experiencing in their local area.
I can say something about that. It's uncommon. When oaks do a huge reproduction bout and produce tons of acorns, often they'll take a year or 2 off. But I'll also say that all of that is really individual to the species of oak. So I live near the Oregon border, and in the Klamath Mountains here, we have an endemic oak that essentially reproduces only after fire. It sits there in the understory for years and years and years, kind of wishing that the sun would hit it. And then you get a fire, and 2 or 3 years later, the thing's grown back enough that it has this huge bout of reproduction. So this is an oak that lives perennially. I mean, they can grow to be, 100 years old, 200 years old, but they might only reproduce every 40, 50, 100 years after fires. So again, California is a rich and diverse place, and what works for, one place in the Sierra Nevada isn't exactly the same as what works on the Central Coast.
Awesome. Yeah, I actually live in the same area. I was Paige's instructor for her California Naturalist course, and I was so confused. I was like, we just had a mast year last year. Why are there so many acorns? Yeah, Melissa, if you'd like to come off mute and ask your question.
Hi. It was more so a comment that I just wanted to touch on the Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and prescribed fire that in our community in the Grass Valley area that we are doing we are incorporating, I wanted to share that one of our California naturalists is actually a Nishnaan Nevada City Rancheria member. And it has been a pleasure working with him and incorporating some of his TEK to how we are applying prescribed fire in our region.
Awesome.
So, somebody had mentioned about how are we going to be incorporating that into land management in the future. So thank you. I just wanted to share that. That one of our
Thank you.
naturalists is supporting the initiative.
Yeah, and another comment that was in the chat was also just another kind of comment thanking the authors for the book. I don't know if you guys are checking out the chat, but they just wanted to thank you all for creating such a palatable yet informative handbook that made it feel easy for them to connect with their natural history and naturalist kind of curiosities, even though that wasn't their original area of study. So I can definitely agree with this. It's a great book for all those who might be doing something else for a job, but just have like a real passion for learning more about their local environment.
Thank you so much, Allie. I wanted to mention that I think Deborah and Greg Denevers far exceeded their volunteer hours in the last 2 years. And they may not put it on the volunteer portal, but I would advocate for a volunteer pin both for 2025, 2024, because they have day jobs and they do this. I don't know how they do this, but I'm so very grateful.
Yeah, so there was another question that me and my team can answer in the chat. So does the second edition have an Audible online version? So we are currently right now working on an audiobook version of the Climate Stewards Handbook. University of California Press is concerned about creating a audio version of the California Naturalist Handbook, just because the graphics are such an integral part of the book itself. But we do recognize that so many people prefer to listen to books, and it's a real accessibility thing that makes it easier for a lot of people to get involved in and read the books through listening. So it's something we're continuing to look into, but we don't have a version currently available. If anyone else on my team wants to add to that, feel free to. Okay, awesome. Well, it's 1 o'clock. I'm just going to wrap it up. If there's any last minute questions, I'm going to stop the recording. If there's any last minute questions, if the authors have a minute or two to stay on, you can feel free to stay on and ask any questions. But if not, I'll just close the room if no one pops off mute and asks any questions. And thank you all again. Thank you for all of the hard work that you all put into making this amazing second edition. I'm getting mine soon and I can't wait to read it. And I hope to see you all next week at the regional rendezvous. And if not then in a little less than a year at the statewide conference.